In March of 1912, the Hillsville Courthouse in Carroll County, Virginia, erupted in gunfire. But that's not really today's story. Instead, we're going to tell what happened to one of the Allen brothers who wasn't directly involved in the gunfire that day, Constable Jack Allen, and his fate in a roadhouse outside Mount Airy, North Carolina. Another one of the stories of Appalachia.
You know, Steve, it seems like when this story about the Carroll County Courthouse, the shooting, comes up, a lot of controversy with it, a lot of different kind of things going on. But like you said, we're not going to talk about it that much, except for the association that Jack Allen has with, you know, at least some of that, what happened there in Hillsville that day.
Yeah, and this is an interesting, I guess, aftermath to that particular episode of Appalachian history that was brought to us by actually one of his descendants.
Wow.
Who said, hey, we've got some family history that we've told, and we'd like you to check that out and maybe do a story on it. And so that's what I did. I got that and did some research in old newspapers and other sources and came up with this very interesting story we're going to tell here in just a second.
Well, we'd like to thank the Allen family or those associated with Jack Allen that was, you know, kind enough to share this with us, because this is a very interesting story.
And it is part of Appalachian history, too. Well, folks, on March 14th, 1912, Floyd Allen was found guilty of assault and interfering with a deputy after he forcibly freed two of his nephews, Wesley and Sidney Edwards, from custody as they were being transported back from North Carolina to the Hillsville jail. His sentence, 1 year in prison. Now, Floyd, who'd vowed for years never to spend a single minute behind bars and who'd kept that promise despite years of being sentenced for mostly minor violations of the law, stood up and told Judge Massey and the jurors, "Gentlemen, I ain't a-going." Then the shooting started. Floyd's sons, Claude and Victor, were there, along with his brothers and other kin. For a minute and a half, shots flew from all sides of that courtroom.
And standing there in the chaos was another Allen, Constable Jasper Allen, who was Floyd's brother. Jasper, who went by the name Jack, was in uniform that day, and he was charged with keeping order. And let's just put it this way, folks, he took no part in the shootout. Well, the relationship between Floyd and Jack Allen was often a violent one. In 1898, when their father Jeremiah died, Floyd and Jack got into a fight over the estate, specifically over who got a barrel of brandy. The argument turned into a gunfight itself, and Floyd shot Jack in the head and then beat him with his pistol. Jack then shot Floyd, and, well, that ended it, at least for the moment. Neither man died, but it's said that Jack Allen carried a silver plate in his skull for the rest of his life.
Well, after the Hillsville shootout, Jack Allen was stripped of his constable's badge. Floyd and his son Claude went on to the electric chair on March 28, 1913. Wesley and Sidney Edwards were eventually captured and sent to prison. And 4 years later, Jack Allen was dead.
It's been more than a century since gunfire echoed inside that Carroll County Courthouse. And while most of the folks know what happened on that March day in 1912, well, what came after that for Jack Allen hasn't gotten near the attention. See, Jack Allen was a Carroll County constable. As such, he drew his gun more than once and buried a son before the courthouse massacre ever made headlines. But in 1916, Jack was killed in a roadhouse by a complete stranger. Now, here's the big questions. Was it a drunken argument? Was it a revenge killing? Or was it something even deeper? Maybe so deep it was maybe even planned. Let's start with a simple business trip to Mount Airy, North Carolina.
Murat, on March 18, 1916, 70-year-old Jack Allen made a run to Mount Airy to sell a wagon load of lumber, something he did from time to earn a bit of cash. On the way back, he stopped to spend the night at a place owned by Mrs. Roberta Martin, a little roadhouse 5 miles outside town. There, he and the other guests enjoyed a warm fire, a hot meal, and some conversation. After supper, as everyone sat by the fire, in walked a man named Will McCraw, 24 years old, and said by some to be a moonshiner, or a blockader, as folks around there called him back then. And what started as a bit of friendly talk turned rather tense when McCraw brought up the Hillsville Courthouse shootout.
Well, McCraw said that Wesley Edwards wasn't as brave as people thought he was. He pretty much called Edwards, you guessed it, a coward. And like his brothers, Jack Allen had a bit of a temper, and he didn't take too kindly to McCraw talking bad about his nephew, especially since he was locked up and he couldn't defend himself. In anger, Jack fired back, telling the young man, "McCraw, you've been talking about Wesley Edwards too much, and he's in the penitentiary, and he cannot defend himself." Mrs. Martin, sensing the tension rising, tried to calm the two men down, but by this time, it was too late.
Before she could get the words out, Allen and McCraw were at each other, fists flying. The other folks in the room scattered, along with Mrs. Martin. Then, 2 shots rang out. McCraw was gone in an instant. In fact, he took off so fast he had to leave his hat and coat behind. And Jack Allen was dead, lying in a pool of blood, shot by Will McCraw. A few days later, 1,000 people showed up at Jack's funeral to pay their respects. He was buried not far from his house in a grave next to that of his son, W.P. Allen, who died in 1908.
Well, Steve, not long after Jack was shot, Will McCraw turned himself in. He was sent to Roanoke for his own safety from any mob that might want to lynch him. You know, things like that were bad, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And when he came in to surrender, it was noted that McCraw had 2 very nasty wounds on his head. His story was that Jack hit him with a pistol before the shots were fired. McCraw claimed that he shot Allen in self-defense. Well, at his trial in May of 1916, McCraw took the stand to tell his side of the story. And in his testimony, he told the jury that Jack had hit him, then wrestled with him after their argument. He said that Jack forced him back over a trunk, then crouched over him, reaching for a gun. That's when McCraw says he fired at Allen, and then he ran, afraid Jack Allen might come back up off the floor with gun in hand to shoot him.
And the jury believed his story. After just a few hours of deliberation, they came back with a verdict of not guilty. So, case closed, right? Well, legally, yes. But folks, that's where we get to what they used to call, back in the day, quote unquote, the rest of the story. Here's what didn't make it into the official story. Now, a few months ago, a listener to the podcast, one of Jack Allen's direct descendants, contacted us and passed on a tale that's apparently been told for years. And now, we want to be clear. What we're about to share is family lore. And we found a few records to back up parts of it, but other pieces, well, we just really don't know, do we, Rod?
No, we don't. And Steve, according to this listener, there may have been more going on than just a fight over words by the fireplace. And get this, this is where it gets a bit dark. One of Jack's daughters had married a man named Hampton McCraw. No relation to Will McCraw that we've been able to find out. Hampton ran a little general store, and Jack, according to the story, wanted him to sell his moonshine there. Hampton refused.
Not long after, Hampton McCraw, Jack's son-in-law, was murdered, the implication being that it was in retaliation for Hampton not selling Jack's shine in his store. Now, I did do some looking, and I found some newspaper reports on this part. And here's how Mr. McCraw died. The incident happened inside a bar that belonged to Jack Allen. On October 17, 1900, Hampton was tending bar when a 25-year-old black man named Jim Gwynn walked in and started causing a scene, becoming boisterous and loud and disturbing the other customers in the bar. Hampton told him to settle down or leave, but Gwynn refused. And when Hampton McCraw moved toward him to throw him out, Gwynn pulled a pistol and shot him 3 times, once in the forehead, once in the neck, and once in the chest. Killed him right there on the spot. Here's where things go quiet as far as the records are concerned. After that killing, Rod, I didn't find anything. No reports. Nothing about an arrest, nothing about a trial, nothing about a lynching, nothing about anything that happened to Jim Gwynn. Kind of like he just vanished. But, according to the family, there's actually more.
You're right, Steve. It's said that Gwynn, after he was arrested, told the sheriff that Jack Allen had paid him to kill Hampton McCraw for not letting him sell his shine in McCraw's store. Now, that's a huge claim. Now, we've not found anything to back it up, but it's the story that's been passed down. And supposedly, yes, those famous detectives of the detective agency, Baldwin-Felts, they heard about this story too, which brings us back to 1916 and the death of Jack Allen.
Well, the Baldwin-Felts agents, you'll remember, were brought in after the Hillsville shooting to track down Floyd and Sidney Allen's kin, those who went out on the run. They were known for getting results, sometimes by force. It's thought the Baldwin-Felts men had it in for Jack Allen, whose son Friel was hiding at Jack's farm during a search by those detectives, even though Jack had proclaimed nobody was there. Friel was later brought in to surrender by his father and was tried and sentenced for his part in the Hillsville shootout. And supposedly, Rod, when the Baldwin-Felts men heard that old rumor that Jack had ordered the murder of his son-in-law, that was enough for them.
Of course, this was the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency.
Oh, yeah.
If somebody had if they had a grudge on somebody, by gosh, they were going to follow up on it. And they allegedly reached out to one man, Will McCraw, the same man who would pull the trigger on Jack in 1916. And let's just tell it to you this way. If the story is true, McCraw had a reason to take the bait. If Hampton McCraw had been kin to him, and if Jack had Hampton killed, well, that would have been personal.
It would indeed, but, Rod, the only thing I found about Will McCraw was on Hugh Hampton McCraw's Find a Gravesite. There his family is listed, and one of his sons was named William Rufus McCraw. Now, this guy could be him, but likely not, because at the time of Jack's death, William Rufus would have been 18, while Will McCraw was 24. And nobody at the time said that the two men had known each other before the fight at the roadhouse. And, you'd think that if this is my grandson, they would have recognized each other, and those people there at the roadhouse would have heard that, don't you think?
Yeah, that's what you'd think, yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I found nothing definitively linking Will McCraw to Hugh McCraw, but I can't totally rule it out. So we may never know whether any of that part of the story is true, but here's what we do know. Jack Allen died by a bullet in a roadhouse. He survived decades of family violence and a courthouse shootout. And in the end, it wasn't law or vengeance or feud that sealed his fate. It was a fight over his family honor with a stranger he'd met.
Wow. And, still, we got to talk about this too. And, I know that newspapers and media and things like that, they're supposed to be accurate, but there could very well have been a mix-up perhaps in the age. Could have been a mix-up in the name, however it was. We don't know that for a fact because, folks, if you've always gone through any kind of U.S. census and you're doing genealogy, you will find names are misspelled, there's wrong birth dates, ages, things like that, and they're written down by people sometimes that, well, I have to say it this way, they were illiterate. A lot of them didn't know how to read and write, but they did it for a job. Now, could that have happened? It's possible. We're speculating about a lot of this, but yeah, it's an interesting mystery, Steve, nonetheless.
Oh, it is indeed. And I guess if there was bad blood, it's possible that, the grandson didn't have anything to do with Jack. And so he wouldn't have known him whenever they actually met. But, again, this is something that we just really don't know. And I don't think we'll ever know the answer for sure about this. And the only thing we know is that Jack Allen was shot and killed there at a roadhouse in Mount Airy, North Carolina.
Wow.
Well, folks, be sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app or catch us on our YouTube channel. We've got more stories just waiting to be told. And speaking of stories, if you got one you think we ought to tell, like this descendant of Jack Allen, please let us know. You never know where it might take us. And if you want to do that, you can catch us on our Facebook page, leave us a message there, or probably better, send us an email at storiespodcast@gmail.com. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.